Hoffman Studios Book Club proudly presents In Another Country by David Constantine, read by Richard Hoffman. When Mrs. Mercer came in, she found her husband looking poorly. "What's the matter now?" she asked, putting down her bags. It startled him. "Can't leave you for a minute," she said. "They've found her," he said. "Found who?" "That girl." "What girl?" "That girl I told you about." "What girl's that?" "Katya." "Katya?" said Mrs. Mercer, beginning to side away the breakfast things. "I don't remember any Katya. I don't remember you telling me about a Katya." "I tell you everything," he said. "I've always told you everything." "Not Katya, you haven't." She took his cup and saucer. "Have you finished here?" He had pushed them aside to make room for a dictionary. He was still in his dressing gown, with a letter in his hand. "My Katya," he said. "I couldn't finish my tea when I read the letter." "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. It worried her. Already it frightened her. Quickly she cleared the table. "Excuse me," she said, "while I shake the cloth." He raised the dictionary. "A name like that," she said, coming back the 2 steps from the kitchen door. "I'd have remembered it. She's foreign by the sound." "I told you," he said. His face had an injured look. One thing he could not bear was her not believing him when he said he'd told her things. "You forget," he said. "No, I do not," she said. "When, then?" That made him think. "A good while back, I grant you. It was a good while back." What worried Mrs. Mercer suddenly took shape. Into the little room came a rush of ghosts. She sat down opposite him, and both felt cold. "That Katya," she said. "Yes," he said. "They've found her in the ice." "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. After a while she said, "I see you found your book." "Yes," he said. "It was behind the pickles. You must have put it there." "I suppose I must," she said. It was an old Cassell's. There were words in the letter, in the handwriting he could not make out, and words in the dictionary he could hardly find in the old Gothic script. Still, he had understood. "Years since I read a word of German," he said. "Funny how it starts coming back to you when you see it again." "I dare say," said Mrs. Mercer. The folded cloth lay between them on the polished table. "It's this global warming," he said, "that we keep hearing about." "What is?" she asked. "Why they found her after all this time." Though he was the one with the information, his face seemed to be asking her for help with it. "The snow's gone off the ice," he said. "You can see right in, and she's still in there, just the way she was." "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. "She would be, wouldn't she?" he added, "when you come to think about it." "Yes," said Mrs. Mercer. "When you come to think about it, I suppose she would." Again, with his face, and with a slight lifting of his mottled hands, he seemed to be asking her to help him comprehend. "Well," she said, after a pause, during which she drew the cloth towards her and folded it again and again. "Can't sit here all day. I've got my club." "Yes," he said, "it's Tuesday. You've got your club." She rose and made to leave the room, but halted in the door and said, "What are you going to do about it?" "Do?" he said. "Oh, nothing. What can I do?" All day in a trance. Katya in the ice. the chaste snow drawn off her. He cut himself shaving, stared at his face, tried to fetch out the 20-year-old from under his present skin. Trickle of blood, pink froth where it entered the soap. He tried to see through his eyes into wherever the soul or spirit or whatever you call it lives that doesn't age with the casing it is in. The little house oppressed him. There was not enough rooms to go from room to room in, nowhere to pace. He looked into the flagstone garden, but the neighbours either side were out and looking over. It drove him, only in his indoor clothes, out and along the road a little way to where the road went down, suddenly, steeply, and the estate of all the same houses was redeemed by a view of the estuary, the mountains, and the open sea. He stood there, thinking of Katya in the ice, stood there so long the lady whose house he was outside standing there came out and asked, "Are you all right, Mr. Mercer?" "Fine," he said, and saw his own face mirrored in hers, ghastly. "I'm too old," he thought. "I don't want it all coming up in me again. We're both of us too old. We don't want it all welling up in us again." But it had begun. "No tea ready," said Mrs. Mercer, putting down her bag. He was sitting on the sofa, queerly to one side, as though somebody should be there next to him. "No," he said, "I didn't know what to get." The blood had dried black in a line down the middle of his chin. "Besides, I'm not feeling too good." "The one day in the week when you get the tea," said Mrs. Mercer. "I know," he said, "I'm sorry." She went to see to it. He came in after her and hung in the doorway of the small room where they cooked and ate. His unease was palpable, whether to stand or sit, whether to speak or not. 2 or 3 times he shrugged. In the end he managed to say, "Where was the trip then?" "Protestin'," she answered brightly. "We went to Protestin'." "You always enjoy your trips," he said. "Yes," she said. "I wouldn't miss a Tuesday trip if I could help it." He had lapsed away again. His face was desolate and absent. His fingers, under their own compulsion, picked at one another. "Yes," she said. "We went to Protestin Market and I got myself a blouse." "I have to see it," he said. "I've been wondering," Mrs. Mercer said when they were face to face across the little table eating. "Why did they write to you about that girl? So long ago it happened, and didn't you tell me you were only passing through?" "I'm next of kin," he said. Mrs. Mercer put down her cup. "I beg your pardon?" "I mean, they think I am. She'd have no mother and father, would she, if you think about it? Besides, they were Jews, dead anyway of age, but very likely dead long before they died of age. And she was only a child, my Katya was." "Yes, but," Mrs. Mercer said, "yes, but so what? I don't see that makes you the next of kin." "Oh, I told them we were married," Mr. Mercer said. "I see," said Mrs. Mercer. "I had to, where we stayed. Not like nowadays. You had to say you were Mr. and Mrs. in those days, and wear a curtain ring." "We never did," said Mrs. Mercer. "We didn't have to, did we?" Mr. Mercer said. "We didn't have to because we really were." "And you two weren't?" "No, no," said Mr. Mercer. "I only said we were." "You never told me you were another woman's next of kin." I did, he said. Besides, I'm not. And if I didn't, it was so as not to upset you. The meal went on and finished. They watched some television. They went to bed. In the dark, it was immediately worse and worse. How old was she? Mrs. Mercer asked. Same age as you, he answered. Nearly to the day. I told you, you're both Virgo. Same age as me, she said. Still is if you think about it. They thought about it.